Today we will learn and reflect on the works of Dionysius, known to the medieval church fathers as St Denis, and to modern scholars and theologians as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. Dionysius, although deprecated by many modern scholars, was one of the most profoundly influential theologians of both the ancient and medieval churches. Dionysius wrote under a pseudonym. Scholars have no clue about his actual identity. This is a list of the church fathers profoundly influenced by Dionysius. In the east, St Maximus the Confessor, Andrew of Crete. In the west, St Thomas Aquinas, John Scotus, Pope Gregory the Great, Albert the Great, and the mystical theologians of the author of the Cloud of Unknowing and Meister Eckhart. From this list, we know that Dionysius has deeply influenced both Eastern and Western giants of the faith. Indeed, references to Dionysius in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas are only outnumbered by his references to Aristotle, and these references include a commentary of the divine names of Dionysius in his Summa Theologica. In contrast, Luther was antagonistic towards the works of Dionysius, and we'll ponder what spiritual insight we can glean from this opposition. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. We were astounded not only by how many of the most influential ancient and medieval theologians were deeply influenced by Dionysius, but also by the number of modern theologians who are similarly eager to write about Dionysius. And this is a mix here. We quote from the Catholic theologians Balthasar, known for his works written after Vatican II, and Copleston, a Jesuit priest who wrote a multi-volume series on philosophy that's included in the curriculum of most Catholic seminaries. And we quote from several well-regarded Orthodox theologians, including Andrew Louth, Andrew McGuckin, and Vladimir Lasky. When he wrote his works referencing Dionysius, Jaroslav Pelikan was one of the most foremost Lutheran theologians, although he did convert in his retirement years. As a reminder, my companion blog has the footnotes and book links referencing the sources I used, and the book links are also in the YouTube scripts I uploaded to SlideShare. Who was Pseudo-Dionysius? St. John of the Cross and St. Thomas Aquinas refer to him as St Denis. And in the introduction of several of the works of Dionysius, he says that they're from Dionysius the Presbyter to his fellow presbyter Timothy, which refers to Dionysius the Areopagite, mentioned in Acts 17:34, which suggested that it had apostolic pedigree. And this work is first mentioned in 533 by Severus, the Patriarch of Alexandria. And other scholars have noted that some of his language has been lifted from the works of the last influential Neo-Platonist philosopher, Proclus. And you can see that St. John of the Cross was writing about a millennium after the late dating of the works written by Dionysius. McGuckin states that although the early Byzantine theological debates tolerated the authorial subterfuge that within a generation or two their apostolic origin was eventually believed, and with this dramatic label, the works came to have a profound influence for centuries to come. Copleston notes that Pope Martin I appealed to St. Denis as authoritative in the First Lateran Council of 649. Now, Dionysius deeply influenced the theology of St. Maximus the Confessor and St. Thomas Aquinas. Who was the author? Copleston states the author was a theologian and without doubt ecclesiastic also, but he could not have been Severus himself, as one or two writers have rashly supposed. There were many church fathers whose theology was profoundly influenced by the works of Dionysius, but Peter Abelard was skeptical of his apostolic credentials. But as Abelard was controversial in his day, his opinion was not widely shared or believed. Abelard's credibility was damaged by his affair with his young student Heloise, which was a famous medieval romance. Are the teachings of Dionysius orthodox? Copleston offers his opinion. Personally, I consider that the writings are orthodox in regard to the rejection of monism, but on the question of the Blessed Trinity, it is highly questionable, at least, if they can be reconciled with Orthodox Christian dogma. Now, monism is the Neo-Platonic notion that everything is derived from the one, from which everything flows. Copleston does note that Dionysius does maintain the doctrine of the Incarnation, although he thinks that this is underemphasized by Dionysius. And Copleston points out that you cannot condemn his teachings on the Incarnation taken as a whole. unless you're prepared to reject as unorthodox, for example, the mystical doctrine of St. John of the Cross, who was a doctor of the Church. Now, was Dionysius a Monophysite? And this term refers to the great Christological controversies decided in the early church ecumenical councils. The First Council of Nicaea had decided that Christ was both human and divine. And the debate continued, and the orthodox position was that both human nature and divine nature were both united in one person, while the Monophysites believed that the human nature was absorbed into the divine nature. Now, this is the simplified Wikipedia explanation, and we'll study this question later when we study the history of the church councils. Andrew Louth states, scholars are still divided as to whether the Christology of Dionysius is Monophysite. And the Patriarch Severus, as we noted, who was the first person to mention the works of Dionysius, he was a Monophysite. And the works of Dionysius influenced both Monophysite and Nestorian theologians, according to Jaroslav Pelikan. Scholars have noted that Dionysius has carefully crafted the wording of his theology so it would be seen as orthodox. And, for example, Pelikan quotes Dionysius from his ecclesiastical hierarchy. Out of love for humanity, Christ emerged from the hiddenness of his divinity to take on human shape, to be utterly incarnate among us while yet remaining unmixed. A formulation that grants the Logos after the union a full and distinct human nature. Now, Pelikan explores whether Dionysius was guilty of monenergism, the belief that Christ had one energy, a rather technical debate, but Pelikan notes that Dionysius could not have anticipated this theological debate, and Dionysius clearly values mysticism over the logical points of theology. Andrew Louth has an excellent summary of these Christological controversies in his book on Dionysius, if you're interested. Now, Protestants, Luther in particular, are quicker to discard the teachings of Dionysius. Now, Luther in his youth was initially amenable to the theological poetry of Dionysius. In an essay by Froelich, and he wrote one of the introductions in the complete works of Dionysius, he states that during his years at Wittenberg, Luther became increasingly negative, ending in total rejection. And the turning point is often linked to the Leipzig Disputation of 1519, where John Eck used Dionysius' work on the ecclesiastical hierarchy as evidence for the apostolic origins of the papal primacy. This was the disputation where Luther debated his beliefs after the uproar caused by his 95 Theses, which preceded his break with the Catholic Church. Luther was wary of scholasticism and the intricate teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas. He thought they relied too heavily on the works of Aristotle and the Neo-Platonism of Dionysius, though his apostolic origins were not universally questioned at the time. In a disputation in 1537, Luther states that Dionysius taught that humans can converse and deal with the inscrutable, eternal majesty of God in this mortal, corrupt flesh without mediation. And he warns his listeners to avoid reading books like the Mystical Theology. And Luther's alternative was the Theology of the Cross. And he also comments, Dionysius is most pernicious. He Platonizes more than he Christianizes. Now, this criticism by Luther reminds us that it is a spiritual trap, that if our desire to focus on what we think is the spiritual side of faith, our love for God, distracts us from our love for our neighbor and to wish our neighbor well, then it is a false spirituality. And indeed, St. John of the Cross, a mystical theologian influenced by Dionysius, warns us of this danger in multiple places. Although the many references in the New Testament of praying in the Spirit is not the same as apophatic or negative theology, these references exhort us in prayer to ask the Spirit for assistance in our prayer life to reach up and ascend to the divine. And the Scriptures exhort, likewise the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Now we'll discuss how modern scholarship regards Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. Scholars in the Renaissance question whether the works of Dionysius indeed dated back to the Apostolic Age, and modern scholars have strong evidence that his works were written in the late 5th or early 6th centuries. Thus modern scholars refer to him as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, although Andrew Louth titles his book about him as Denis the Areopagite. Like Andrew Louth, my preference is to jettison the pseudo-label, as we can still learn much from a work revered by so many ancient and medieval church fathers. My preference is to refer to them as works by Dionysius. Now, did Dionysius expect that his reading audience would see the joke? Now, personally, I think that Dionysius would have been astounded that he fooled so many for so long that he was truly a theologian from the apostolic era. Which leads us to another question. How did the Renaissance scholars initially detect that Dionysius was written by someone centuries after the apostolic age? Simple. The Renaissance scholars first examined the internal evidence in the works themselves, using refined techniques of philology. Simply put, these scholars simply read the breadcrumbs Dionysius laid out in the text, revealing his background, including the obvious influence of Neoplatonic philosophers like Plotinus and Proclus. Now, in the century prior to Luther, philologists also determined that the donation of Constantine, which purported to be a 4th century donation where the first Christian Roman Emperor Constantine transferred authority over Rome to the Pope, was actually a 13th century forgery, since the language in the document used words and usage from that later century. And the Catholic Church had been using this donation to support its claims of papal authority, and by association, the discovery of this forgery likely harmed the credibility of the works of Dionysius. Now, Dionysius does lay it on thick. His short 10 epistles include epistles to Polycarp, a hierarch, Titus the hierarch, and St. John the Theologian, apostle and evangelist, in exile on the island of Patmos, which are intended to confirm his apostolic succession. But he also addresses several of these short epistles to monks. Since monasticism arose after the apostolic age, after Emperor Constantine ended the persecution of Christians, could Dionysius be suggesting that his apostolic succession is only a literary device? Andrew Louth explores this symbolism. Dionysius was the first of Paul's converts in Athens, and Athens means philosophy, and more precisely, Plato. Plato had commonly, if not quite always, been respected by Christians. Early Christians, like St. Justin Martyr, had greatly revered Plato, if dissenting from some of his doctrines. For much of the 5th century, the head of the Platonic Academy in Athens was the great pagan philosopher Proclus. Louth suggests that the pseudonym expressed the author's belief that the truths that Plato grasped belong to Christ and are not abandoned by embracing faith in Christ. Writing works in the name of a somewhat contemporary Christian saint was common in the ancient world. Often this was seen as a sign of admiration and respect, although adding credibility to the work was also a motivation. But it was unusual to credit your work to saints over 4 centuries ago. Dionysius also unusually refers to his other works. For example, he says, "In my theological representations, I have praised certain notions, but this and several other referenced works have either been lost, or, as many scholars suspect, they are also simply literary devices." What a great literary device that would be! You quickly describe a brilliant idea, which you credit to a much longer work you never actually wrote, or which you intended to write in a future that never quite arrives. Vladimir Leclercq has one of the most interesting quotes on the central theology of Dionysius, and he distinguishes 2 possible theological ways. One, that of cataphatic or positive theology, proceeds by affirmations, what God is. And the other is the apophatic or negative theology, by negations, what God is not. And positive theology leads us to some knowledge of God, but in an imperfect way. But negative theology leads us to total ignorance, which acknowledges that we can never truly know God. Then Leclercq compares these 2 ways of understanding God. All knowledge has as its object that which is. Now God is beyond all that exists. In order to approach him, it is necessary to deny all that is inferior to him, that is to say, all that which is. And this is where the title of the most famous theological work, The Cloud of Unknowing, comes from. If, in seeing God, one can know what one sees, then one has not seen God in himself by something intelligible, something which is inferior to him. It is by unknowing that one may know him who is above every possible object of knowledge. Though the idea of deification can be supported by many verses in the New Testament, Eastern Christian theologians like St. Maximus the Confessor formulated the analogy that Christ condescends to descend to take on flesh in his incarnation to save our souls. So Christ adopts us as sons of his Father so that we may ascend to salvation in our deification. St. Maximus the Confessor was influenced in his views of deification of the faithful by the writings of Dionysius. Pelikan says this: "The principle of deification was the beatitude of God himself, that by which he was God. His goodness conferred the gift of salvation and deification on all rational and intelligent beings." And Pelikan references the ecclesiastical hierarchy by Dionysius, where Dionysius teaches that the incorporeal heavenly hierarchy belongs to the domain of the conceptual, something out of this world. But we see our human hierarchy, as our nature permits, multiplied in a multitude of perceptible symbols, lifting us upward hierarchically until we are brought as far as we can into the unity of divination. And John Anthony McGuckin has an interesting discussion of how profoundly Dionysius and the religious metaphysics of the Neoplatonists affected the early Byzantine Christians. First, in a time when the works of Eriugena were severely criticized, he promoted Origen's ancient principle that the believer must go apu logos agai, which means that where reason leads the mind, so too is God the Logos beckoning, which is very close to our channel's philosophy. And second, Christians found in the Neoplatonists a dialogue partner, not a series of texts to be plagiarized. It was useful when missionaries seek to translate the Semitic gospel to a Hellenized world. Third, this dynamism views the metaphysics of Dionysius as a descent from the first principle, the sublime ineffable. My question is McGuckin here referring to Origen's controversial work on first principles, which guaranteed the church would never declare him a saint? McGuckin is referring to how Christianity appropriates Neoplatonic concepts. All being holds its coherence from the one, and the marks of the Logos are within all things. And fourth, Dionysius was concerned with how to speak about God, apophatically using negation of words and ideas, or cataphatically using ideas from the material world. The apophatic path is both more challenging and more rewarding. Last, the stress on order and dependent relationships in the ascent to God, which Dionysius emphasizes so much in his view of angels and clerical ranks in his two treatises on the hierarchies, provided immense intellectual stimulation to the Christian Western world in the Dark Ages, and which inspired the mystics with the concept of the deification of the believer. And medieval Catholics saw in these works and the hierarchies divine affirmation for respect for the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. But even if you're Protestant, you can nevertheless interpret Dionysius as teaching the message that you should respect the hierarchy of the church you attend, whether your church has a national hierarchy or whether your church is an individual congregational church. The work of Dionysius, that is by far the shortest and is the most succinct statement of his apophatic or negative theology, is the mystical theology. And after we examine that work, we'll examine his divine names, which has attracted the most commentary from Copleston, St. Thomas Aquinas, and many other theologians. And we will close with a quote from Balthasar from his book, The Cosmic Liturgy, The Universe According to St. Maximus the Confessor. St. Maximus entered the history of theology not only as the victor in the dispute over the two wills in Christ, his divine immortal will, but also as the man who assured a lasting home in the church for the writings of Dionysius, thanks to his orthodox interpretation of them. Whether Dionysius, in fact, needed such justification, whether he really was the half-Neoplatonic mystic that one likes to make him today, and was not rather one of the most powerful Christian thinkers of all time, need not be decided here. It is certain that he aroused a divided response very early, alongside enthusiasm, skepticism, and cool diffidence. And what is true is that St. Maximus grasped the value, the originality, and the fruitfulness of the works of Dionysius, and that through his spirited championing of their genuineness, as well as his work of interpretation, he became one of the heralds of the triumphant march of Dionysius through the Latin Middle Ages. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. My copy of the complete works of Dionysius had been sitting on my bookshelf for many years, but I had no idea how influential it was until I ran across a direct reference to the mystical theology of Dionysius by St. John of the Cross's work, Dark Night of the Soul, and realized that Dionysius painted the Dark Night of the Soul a millennium before. And since we'll have several videos on Dionysius, we will cover what will be our sources in this video. In the complete works of Pseudo-Dionysius, the translation is good, with excellent footnotes, and this compilation of his complete known works includes valuable introductions by Jaroslav Pelikan and two other authors, one of which we've quoted. And The Dark Night of the Soul is a good English translation of this work, with good footnotes, and it is a challenge to read, but it's worth sticking to it. And Andrew Louth's book on Dionysius is quotable in its own right. It includes both an introductory discussion and commentary on each of his complete works, and it's simply outstanding. And Copleston's History of Philosophy is used by Catholic seminaries, and we like to consult his history first. He covers Dionysius, and most of his commentary is on his work, The Divine Names. And the Orthodox McGuckin's History of the First Millennium of the Church includes chapters on how the Church influenced many aspects of daily life in the ancient world, and reviews both the history and literature of the early Church, including Dionysius. And we did quote extensively from his comments on Dionysius. And going to the next three works, these 3 volumes of Pelikan include references to Dionysius' works in both the ancient and medieval churches. And Pelikan's 5-volume set on the history of Christian doctrine includes many snippets from the original works and a balanced discussion with little polemic bias. And he always consults the original works in their original languages whenever possible. Pelikan assumes you already have a basic knowledge of church history. And the other 2 volumes, volume 4 and 5, are on the Reformation in the modern church through Vatican II. Now, Balthasar's commentary on the works of St. Maximus the Confessor includes comments on the works of Dionysius, since they are heavily influenced by St. Maximus. And Balthasar is one of the most prominent post-Vatican II theologians, and I think he's quotable, and is easier to read than his reputation would suggest. And like Louth's book, it's enlightening as a primary source. And of course, La Noche Oscura is the original Spanish version of St. John of the Cross. Another work we didn't quote too much, Eros and Allegory, opens with a discussion of Dionysius, and it also studies the commentaries on the Song of Songs, a favorite of monastics, who read this love poem as an allegory of our love for God. And the book by Leclercq, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, has an excellent reputation, and we plan to do a video on this book as well. Now, the ancient church fathers that influenced Dionysius the most was St. Gregory of Nyssa, in particular his life of Moses and his ascent up the mountain, which we definitely plan to dedicate a video to. We've cut videos on his commentary on the Beatitudes, which are referenced by the Catholic Catechism, and this work also describes an ascent up the mountain, leaving behind the Platonic cave of ignorance. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, as we've said before, has a commentary on the Divine Names by Dionysius in his Summa Theologica, and used copies of the individual volumes of the great books were quite inexpensive. And most of the Philokalia, Volume 2, contains works by St. Maximus the Confessor, whose mystical theology was heavily influenced by Dionysius. Personally, I find the works of St. Maximus the Confessor easier to read than Dionysius himself, and definitely easier to read than St. John of the Cross. And we also have a video that talks about the history of the Philokalia, the classics of the Eastern Church Fathers. And we ran across another interesting article on the OCA website on the hero martyr Dionysius the Areopagite, Bishop of Athens, which I think you'll enjoy. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends, and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.